The harshest way you betray yourself is not always loud. Sometimes it happens after the conversation ends and the room goes quiet. You replay one moment, turn it into a verdict, and sentence yourself in private. On the outside, you still look composed, helpful, even functional. Inside, you are being dragged across your own mind. That is why self-cruelty is deeper than obvious self-criticism. It is also smiling while your chest tightens and calling that strength. It is pushing through when your soul is pleading for a pause. It is making one mistake at noon and punishing yourself until midnight. It is deserting yourself from the inside while pretending nothing happened. Buddha did not point to suffering so you could hate your mind harder. He pointed to suffering so you could finally see what keeps feeding it. And one thing feeds it more than most people realize: clinging. You are clinging to a version of yourself that never trembles, never stalls, never disappoints. So every ordinary human moment feels like proof that you failed to be worthy. That is why even on days when nobody attacks you, you still come home wounded. The world may not have cut you, but your inner voice finishes the job. You bleed from the standards you use like weapons against your own heart. You bruise under the pressure of having to be clear, calm, capable, and untouched. And the saddest part is that you have started calling this discipline. What changes your life is not becoming stricter with yourself. It is ending the secret war you start every time you feel too much. Every time you fall short, panic, freeze, or need more than you wanted to need. Buddha did not teach domination over pain. He taught clear seeing of its roots. And your pain has a face right now, the way you turn against yourself in silence. So before we go any further, say this where you can see it. Write it in the comments, whisper it, or let it land somewhere real. I stop abandoning myself. Because healing does not begin when life becomes easier. It begins the moment you refuse to become your own executioner. You think the problem is that you feel too deeply. Many times the real problem is that you shame yourself for feeling it all. You call yourself weak for crying, unstable for slowing down, lazy for resting. You call yourself lost because you do not know the next move yet. And then you wonder why every emotion becomes heavier than it needed to be. Buddha taught that between what arises and what you do with it, there is space. Your entire life is being broken or rebuilt inside that space. Not inside the event itself, but inside your response to it. How many times today did the moment hurt once, and your commentary hurt it 10 more times? How many wounds were facts, and how many were the words you used on yourself afterward? You were taught to watch yourself the wrong way, not to understand yourself, but to police yourself, not to listen, but to monitor, correct, and tighten every loose edge. So now you walk into conversations already observing yourself from the outside. You speak and immediately judge the way you sounded while speaking. When you stay quiet, you accuse yourself of being inadequate. When you try, you pressure yourself harder than the situation ever did. When you fail, you turn a moment into a character assessment. This prison is so refined that you often mistake it for maturity. But sometimes, what you call self-awareness is just fear of being imperfect. Seeing the mind is not the same as crushing the mind. That distinction matters more than you think. Feeling anger is one thing. Becoming ashamed that anger appeared is another. Feeling sadness is one thing. Treating yourself like damaged goods because sadness came is another. The pain arrives, then the second blow comes from your own hand. That second blow sounds familiar, does it not? You are too much. You are the problem. You are a burden. You should be better than this by now. In Buddhist teaching, suffering grows where attachment and rejection take root. Your attachment is to the polished character you think you must perform. Your rejection is aimed at every human part that refuses to match that character. Anything messy, tired, needy, grieving, uncertain, or slow gets pushed away. So you do not only suffer because life is hard, you suffer because you demand inhuman purity from yourself. That is why you can feel exhausted before the day even begins. You wake up, and the negotiations start immediately. Today, I must deliver. Today I cannot slip. Today I am not allowed to feel this again. Notice the violence hiding in that language. You do not enter the day as someone alive. You enter it as someone on trial. And once you live that way long enough, even simple existence feels like underperforming. Buddha warned that the agitated mind builds prisons faster than circumstances do. You also betray yourself every time you refuse to hear your own pain until it explodes. You say yes when your whole body means no. You laugh when what you need is withdrawal, quiet, and air. You keep going long after your limits have already been crossed. Then later, you ask why you feel numb, empty, or far away from yourself. How could you not? You keep placing yourself last and renaming it strength. But wisdom is not emotional hardening. Wisdom is catching the exact moment you start leaving yourself behind just to stay acceptable. It is seeing the betrayal while it is still small enough to interrupt. There is another pattern you may know so well that it no longer even shocks you. A late reply, a missed deadline, an awkward sentence, one delayed decision. Something small happens. Within seconds, your mind expands it into a full portrait of who you are. A mistake becomes evidence. A stumble becomes identity. A bad day becomes a life sentence. Buddha understood something terrifying about the mind. It manufactures stories and then kneels before them as if they were truth. Your suffering multiplies every time you call yourself by the name of a passing storm. This is why looking inward feels dangerous. You think you will find ugliness, failure, confusion, and collapse. But often what scares you most is not what you will find. It is what you will have to stop pretending once you finally look. You will have to stop pretending you can hold everything forever. Stop pretending you do not need rest, softness, or help. Stop pretending silence means peace when sometimes it only means suppression. Real practice begins there, not in performance, not in spiritual theater, not in sounding evolved. It begins in honest contact with what is actually happening inside you. And honesty hurts at first because it tears you away from the lie that was protecting you. Still, that pain is cleaner than the life built on denial. There is an even harder truth. Sometimes you do not really want peace. You want control. You want to control how you are seen, what you feel, how long healing takes when clarity arrives. And because life refuses to obey, you live clenched against reality. Buddha taught impermanence because everything changes, slips, dissolves, and moves. You cannot grip life without bruising your own hands. The tighter you squeeze your inner world, the farther you drift from yourself. This is why your relationship with yourself became so unforgiving. You only grant yourself value when you perform. You respect yourself when you get it right. You breathe freely only when you believe you earned it. You feel deserving only when you match the image. So rest feels suspicious. Limits feel embarrassing. Need becomes shame. That is not self-respect. That is a brutal contract. And every contract built on conditional worth eventually turns love into labor. The beginning of change is not becoming a different person overnight. It is stopping the violence in your own voice before it becomes your entire atmosphere. When the mind says, "You ruined everything," learn to notice the sentence as a sentence, not as truth. When the urge to humiliate yourself appears, catch it before you obey it. When the urge to flee what you feel rises, stay for one breath longer than usual. That is mindfulness in plain language. Not passivity, not weakness, not letting life collapse around you. It is refusing to hand your nervous system over to automatic war. Because what keeps hurting you is not only what happened, it is the way you keep reliving it internally every day. You repeat old rejection whenever you reject yourself. You repeat old abandonment whenever you ignore your own pain. You repeat old humiliation whenever you speak to yourself with contempt. You repeat old fear whenever you demand perfection in exchange for love. So, your inner world becomes a windowless hallway with the same echo on repeat. But what was learned can also be unlearned, and this is where everything becomes serious. If you are not every thought that passes through you, then who are you? Who are you when you stop believing every accusation your mind produces? Who are you when you remain present without joining the attack? Maybe, for the first time, you are the awareness that notices without striking, the point of stillness that sees anger without becoming anger, the quiet witness that feels fear without kneeling to fear. Buddha taught non-self in part to loosen the grip of false identity. What changes constantly cannot be the whole of what you are. A thought moves, so it cannot be your master. An emotion swells and falls, so it cannot be your final sentence. Something in you is noticing all of that movement, and your relationship with yourself changes the moment you stop naming yourself after whatever just passed through. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean pretending nothing hurts. It does not mean smiling through damage and calling that transcendence. It means feeling fully without turning your heart into a courtroom. It means saying, "This hurt me," without adding, "Therefore I am weak." For a long time, you did not simply live your emotions. You lived the judgment attached to them. And that judgment stole even your right to suffer cleanly. Clean suffering is pain without the extra poison. The loss already hurt. You did not need to pour shame, comparison, panic, and self-hatred over it. Buddhist wisdom often points to how the mind stacks layers upon layers. One arrow lands, then the mental war launches 100 more. The breakup hurts, then comes the story that you were never enough. The exhaustion hurts, then comes the story that resting makes you worthless. The confusion hurts, then comes the story that everyone else knows how to live except you. This is why stopping matters so much. Not because stopping solves everything instantly, but because stopping lets you hear what constant motion was drowning out. The fatigue you were calling laziness, the grief you were disguising as busyness, the fear you were dressing up as discipline. And listening to that is not failure. It may be the first real act of loyalty you have shown yourself in years. You also need to see the cruelty hidden inside your rush to improve. Sometimes your urgency to heal is not born from love. Sometimes it is born from disgust. You want to get better quickly, so you do not have to look at the wreckage. You want to fix yourself quickly so you can become acceptable again. You want relief, but sometimes what you really want is distance from your own humanity. That is still rejection dressed as growth. Buddha did not teach inner panic, he taught a path, and a path asks for presence. When the mind screams for immediate transformation, ask what feeling it is trying to outrun. When the pressure rises, ask what fear is hiding under the pressure. When shame appears, ask what image of perfection feels threatened. This is real practice, bringing light to what used to operate in the dark. Because in the dark, your mind has almost always been crueler than reality. Maybe one of your deepest wounds is this: you only seem to deserve your own tenderness when you are doing well. When you are clear, generous, strong, beautiful inside, useful to others, inspiring to watch. But the moment you become tired, confused, sensitive, heavy, or lost, you shut the door on yourself. Yet that is the exact moment your relationship with yourself reveals the truth. Real love does not show up only when the room is clean. Buddha also spoke about cultivation. A field is not forced into bloom by shame. It is tended with attention, protection, patience, and time. You do not scream at the soil because spring has not arrived yet. You remove what suffocates. You water what needs life. You shelter what is still fragile. Why then do you expect yourself to flower under constant threat? Nothing healthy grows beneath relentless internal punishment. And maybe this shakes you because part of you is afraid of kindness. You think if you become gentler with yourself, you will lose your edge. You imagine harshness is the engine that keeps you moving. The inner whip feels familiar, reliable, proven. But look at the cost of being driven that way. Yes, you keep going, but you keep going injured. You keep going without presence, without joy, without clean breath. You keep building versions of yourself that know how to obey, but not how to belong. That is not strength. That is survival that forgot to stop surviving. Mindfulness is not only something you do on a cushion. It happens in ordinary life, in the precise second you start attacking yourself inside. After the weird conversation, after the unanswered message, after the comparison, after the small failure, the mirror glance, the unmet expectation, that is where practice begins. The moment you notice the old voice arriving with a blade in its hand. And when it comes, do not answer violence with more violence. See it. Name it. This is guilt. This is fear. This is shame. This is my mind trying to protect me the wrong way. That tiny gap changes everything, because the part of you that sees is not fully possessed by what it sees. You spent years believing self-harshness was proof of depth or conscience. Often it was only a survival habit shaped in an older season. Maybe once, in your life, mistakes were dangerous and need was punished. Maybe disappointing people cost you love. Maybe feeling too much made you feel hard to keep. So your mind built an inner inspector to keep you safe. But inspectors do not retire just because the emergency ends, and you have kept living as if you still need permission to exist without tension. That is why compassion, in Buddha's path, is not decorative. It is medicine. Compassion is not pretending everything is fine. It is looking at pain without adding contempt. It is admitting this is hard without turning hardship into moral failure. It is staying beside yourself when your old pattern would have walked away. It is refusing to use awareness as a weapon, because awareness without kindness becomes a knife. And you have already cut yourself enough with your own insight. Maybe your deepest loneliness was never a lack of people. Maybe it was the absence of refuge inside yourself. No place to rest when the day grew heavy. No home in your own presence. Even alone, you still felt watched, measured, corrected. That kind of exhaustion eats deeper than any schedule ever could. So the question changes. Not, how do I improve fast enough to deserve peace? But, how do I stop being a hostile place for myself to live? The answer may begin in things your old mind considered too small to matter. In the way you breathe after a mistake. In the way you speak to yourself after you miss the mark. In the way you receive your own fatigue. In the way you stop turning every emotion into an emergency. In the way you refuse to define yourself by one hard day. In the way you stay present a few seconds longer before reacting. In the way you stop demanding perfection before offering yourself respect. In the way you understand that peace does not come from defeating yourself. It comes from no longer chasing yourself with a weapon. And once that truth starts sinking in, another question rises. How many of your choices are still being run by the part of you terrified of meeting yourself unarmored? Because when the armor starts falling, the avoided questions arrive. Who are you without the constant job of looking strong? Who are you without pleasing, proving, managing, and holding it all together? Who are you when your mind can scream and you still do not obey it? Who are you when presence becomes louder than accusation? Who are you when silence stops being a threat and starts feeling like home? Who are you when dignity is no longer something you have to earn? Who are you when tenderness is allowed to exist before achievement? Who are you when the old methods of hurting yourself no longer feel noble? And what else becomes possible if you keep looking, and this time, do not run? Most people think they are exhausted because life is heavy, but many are worn out by the performance they keep running inside. The constant attempt to stay above shame, above rejection, above ordinary human fragility. That private performance drains more life from you than most problems ever could. Look closely, and you may find that many of your choices were never free. They were shields shaped like preferences, ambition, independence, and control. You were not only trying to build a life, you were trying not to feel small, trying not to feel disposable, forgettable, or easy to leave behind. And fear, when repeated long enough, starts dressing itself like identity. That is why some paths in your life felt strangely familiar from the beginning. You moved toward people who touched the same old bruise in a new way. You entered spaces where your worth always seemed one step away from proof. You chased goals that looked like dreams, but secretly functioned like rescue missions. You told yourself it was destiny, while your wounds quietly called it home. Buddha spoke with brutal precision about cause and effect within the mind. What you keep watering inside does not stay inside for long. It starts shaping your attention, your reactions, your choices, your tolerance, your hunger. So when rejection lives at the root, even your search for love can repeat the injury. And when inadequacy sits beneath the surface, success can become another form of begging. This is why hidden intention matters more than polished behavior. Perfectionism may look noble while secretly trembling with the fear of being unloved. People-pleasing may look generous while quietly panicking at the thought of being abandoned. Emotional coldness may look strong while simply being exhaustion after feeling too much for too long. And urgency may not be passion at all, but terror of standing still with yourself. The moment you begin to see that hidden engine, something loosens. Not because the pain disappears on command, not because you suddenly become serene, wise, and untouched, but because what is seen clearly loses some of its power to run you from the dark. Light does not erase the room at once, but it ends the room's authority. Still, truth hurts when it first arrives. It hurts to admit how often you did not really want love, only relief. How often you did not want intimacy, only distraction from your own mind. How often you reached for noise, romance, work, or fantasy just to escape your own presence. A wounded relationship with yourself makes silence feel like danger instead of rest. That is why stillness can feel unbearable. The moment the noise fades, the real things start speaking. The fatigue you postponed, the ache you renamed discipline, the emptiness you covered with momentum. No wonder the hand reaches for the phone, the task, the snack, the chat, the next demand. Running is not always lack of focus. Often it is fear without a costume. Buddha's teaching on attention goes far beyond noticing the breath. It is also learning to catch the urge to flee before it hijacks your whole day. The instant you feel exposed and rush to fill the space with anything at all. The reflex to make contact, make progress, make noise, make a plan, make yourself disappear. Attention reveals that many of your habits are not preferences, but escape routes. And fear does not heal by being shouted down. It does not soften because you insult it, threaten it, or call it weakness. It changes when it is met without panic and without surrender. It changes when you stop multiplying it with shame. Presence does what force has failed to do for years. This is also why you can feel tired, even on quiet days. There is a hidden war happening beneath your normal face. You are trying not to look needy, not to look uncertain, not to look affected. You are managing your image even in rooms where nobody asked you to perform. That invisible management steals energy from the one thing that could actually free you. Because real freedom begins where grasping begins to loosen. And you are grasping even at the image you want to have of yourself. You want to look inward and find someone always centered, always admirable, always composed. But life never hands anyone that frozen portrait for long. Life arrives as motion, contradiction, rhythm, weather, and change. Some days bring courage, and some bring heaviness. Some mornings open with clarity, and some begin inside fog. Sometimes love expands you, and sometimes fear contracts everything in sight. Buddha did not mention impermanence as a side note to comfort the anxious. He placed it at the center because control keeps breaking against it. When you demand permanent steadiness from a changing life, every shift feels threatening. A tired afternoon starts looking like personal decline. One sad evening starts sounding like proof of failure. A relapse becomes a verdict, not a moment. That happens when healing is measured like output instead of lived like truth. But healing is not a report card. Presence is not perfection with better branding. Maturity is not never stumbling again. Maturity is noticing the fall sooner and refusing to dig the hole deeper with your own hands. It is ending the second injury, even when the first one still hurts. There is another painful thing to notice. Punishment can masquerade as seriousness, as responsibility, even as moral depth. You may believe suffering proves that you care, while ease feels suspicious and softness feels weak. That belief is old, seductive, and quietly destructive. Buddha did not offer guilt as a path to freedom. He pointed toward understanding, which is a completely different movement of the soul. Understanding asks where this grasping began and what this rejection is trying to defend. It notices the confusion in the mind without turning confusion into an identity. That shift changes you from a defendant into an honest witness. And an honest witness carries a different kind of strength. It does not need to shout, threaten, shame, or break you into obedience. It can look at jealousy, fear, attachment, vanity, and pain without dramatizing any of them. It sees what is there and stays. That staying is stronger than cruelty ever was. Many people have never truly experienced being seen inwardly without being crushed. To notice something petty in themselves and not spiral into self-disgust. To admit a need and not call it pathetic. To spot a craving for approval and not conclude they are fake or broken. That kind of seeing cleans the mind more than panic ever could. Because poison thrives in hidden places. What remains unexamined gains a strange mystical force. What you can face plainly begins to lose its secret charge. Your mind has dark rooms that do not need more judgment. They need light, honesty, and the courage not to flinch. This is where a gentler inner stance becomes revolutionary. Not sugary denial, not pretending everything is beautiful, not sentimental weakness. A firm refusal to add fresh harm to existing pain. A quiet inner promise that says, I will not strike where I am already bruised. For a person trained in self-injury of the mind, that is a radical act. Imagine what changes when a mistake does not instantly become a definition, when rejection does not become evidence that you are unworthy, when delay does not become proof that your life is ruined, when an emotion does not become your permanent name. Discomfort remains discomfort, but it stops turning into destiny. A great deal of suffering comes from making passing states permanent in your imagination. One hard hour becomes a lifelong identity. One contraction becomes a prophecy. One wound becomes the lens through which all love is interpreted. Buddha saw clearly how attachment builds prisons out of mental repetition, and what happens inside you spills directly into your relationships. If you believe love must be earned, you will accept scraps and call them enough. If guilt fills your chest, you will apologize for taking up ordinary human space. If you feel like a burden, you will shrink before anyone even asks you to. If you feel fundamentally insufficient, loneliness will start negotiating against your dignity. That is why changing your relationship with yourself is not decorative self-help. It alters the kind of silence you tolerate and the kind of treatment you excuse. It changes who you chase, who you fear, and who you believe you deserve. It changes how much of yourself you sacrifice just to stay chosen. And it changes the price you are willing to pay for belonging. When you finally begin standing on your own side, something old starts dying. The myth that self-violence is necessary for growth. The belief that hatred will refine you faster than patience. The superstition that more inner pain will somehow make you worthy of peace. That death can feel terrifying because the cruelty once looked like protection. It looked like discipline, maturity, seriousness, even wisdom. But often, it was only fear trying to keep control through pressure. And when that counterfeit strength starts collapsing, you discover something better beneath it. Responsibility without contempt, honesty without humiliation, structure without torture. A steadier force that does not require you to become your own enemy. Buddha described a middle way for a reason, not collapse, not self-attack, not indulgence, not brutality. Many people know only two gears with themselves, overdrive, or surrender. They push until they fracture, then they fall and call themselves hopeless. The middle way interrupts both extremes with clear, humane steadiness. It asks you to do what matters without turning each step into a referendum on your worth. It asks for consistency without demanding emotional perfection. It asks for care without obsession, honesty without cruelty, effort without self-erasure. And that shifts everything, because the task stops deciding who you are. Action becomes possible without self-destruction riding in the passenger seat. You were trained to confuse value with performance, produce, and you matter, impress, and you count, please people, and you earn temporary permission to relax. But the moment you miss, slow down, or go unseen, you feel reduced. This is why small things can hit you like earthquakes while others barely notice them. An unanswered message is not just an unanswered message. A strange look is not just a strange look. A plan falling apart is not just inconvenience. Each one touches the old hunger to feel sufficient and safe. If that hidden wound is not recognized, you keep arguing with the surface. You fight the event while the deeper injury quietly runs the entire response. You think you are upset about today when much of you is reacting from years ago. Buddha's insight cuts through that confusion by asking what is actually being touched inside. The facts matter, but the unseen wound often decides their volume. At the center of much suffering is the demand for guarantees. Guarantee that you will be loved, understood, chosen, protected, and unbroken. Guarantee that you will not fail in the one place failure feels unbearable. Guarantee that no one will step on the old bruise again. But life never signs that contract, no matter how carefully you negotiate. So the mind keeps trying to force certainty from a world built from movement. It wants certainty in affection, certainty in healing, certainty in reputation, certainty in feeling. Yet people change, bodies change, seasons change, thoughts change, desires change. And when you demand stillness from what is alive, tension becomes your daily climate. That is what happens when control becomes your religion. Presence moves in the opposite direction. It does not freeze reality long enough to make you feel secure. It lets things be felt without being chained. It lets a wave remain a wave instead of making it a destiny. It notices motion without turning motion into a life sentence. And letting go is not coldness. Many people fear that less clinging means less love, less commitment, less meaning. But freedom does not cancel care. It cleans it. You can love deeply without bleeding from your grip. You can dedicate yourself fully without making the outcome your identity. You can care without making fear the center of the relationship. You can show up without handing your soul to control. That includes your relationship with yourself. Feeling intensely is not the true problem most of the time. What destroys you is what you do to yourself after the feeling appears. You feel fear and immediately call yourself weak. You feel need and decide you are pathetic. You feel envy and brand yourself small. You feel anger and conclude you are bad. You feel sadness and treat yourself like something damaged beyond repair. But an emotion is a movement, not a moral verdict. It rises, speaks, shifts, and leaves when it is not chained down. Suffering swells when you turn that movement into character evidence. Mindfulness, in ordinary language, is remembering to be here while that process begins. Not later, not after the avalanche, but at the first crack in the snow. You notice the comparison as it sparks. You notice the shame as it reaches for the old script. You notice the urge to disappear, explain, overwork, overtalk, or shut down. That early noticing changes everything because it interrupts the inherited sequence. You do not need to wait until the flood owns you to remember you can step aside. A huge part of pain comes from inner resistance, not only feeling sadness, but hating that sadness is here. Not only feeling anxiety, but being furious that anxiety showed up again. Not only feeling lonely, but despising your own need for closeness. The original emotion may have passed, but war pins it in place. That is why the practice is not, how do I never feel this again? The practice is, how do I stop making this heavier with panic, pride, and self-attack? That change is enormous. It means you stop pouring fuel on every fire that rises inside. You become less interested in conquest and more interested in contact. Sometimes contact begins through the body before the mind agrees. A real breath, not a decorative concept. Feet on the floor, shoulders noticed, air moving in and out. The chest is tight, yes, but tightness is not prophecy. The body returns you to what is happening before the story takes over. Buddha emphasized this grounded attention because the mind writes endless fiction when wounded. It predicts, accuses, exaggerates, and repeats. The body interrupts that spiral with something immediate and undeniable. Breath is happening. The floor is here. Right now has not yet become the catastrophe your thoughts are trying to compose. That matters more than most people understand. Many have lived for years inside mental slogans spoken with such emotion that they felt like truth. I ruin everything. Nobody stays. I only matter when I deliver. Pain makes me unlovable. Repetition gave those sentences power, but repetition never turned them into facts. Pain is not proof. Fear is not proof. A long history is not a life sentence. Seeing that does not erase what happened to you. It simply stops the past from dictating every minute of the present. This is why compassion in Buddhist teaching is not softness for the sake of appearance. It is deep intelligence. It breaks the chain that usually links one hurt to 10 more. You feel what is true, you name what is here, and you refuse to add contempt. That single refusal can begin a completely different life. Then the question changes. Not how do I become flawless enough to finally deserve acceptance, but what begins to grow when I stop demanding flawlessness before offering myself presence. What changes in my choices when movement no longer requires self-cruelty? What changes in my relationships when I stop asking others to confirm a value I keep withholding from myself? What changes in silence when it stops being a torture chamber and starts becoming shelter? What changes in the way you look at your own reflection when you are not hunting only for defects? What changes in your body when it no longer has to brace against your own mind? What changes in your future when your inner climate becomes less violent? A life can reorganize itself around that shift more than you realize. Maybe the deepest transformation is not dramatic at first. Maybe it looks like staying with yourself for one breath longer after a mistake. Maybe it looks like not turning pain into identity before the day is over. Maybe it looks like letting a feeling pass through without kneeling before its accusation. Maybe it looks like dignity returning in quiet ways no one else can see yet. And once that begins, another fear appears. The fear that without harshness you will fall apart. The fear that cruelty has been the only thing holding you together. The fear that kindness will make you soft, careless, weak, forgettable. But maybe the opposite is true. Maybe what has been making you unstable is not kindness, but constant inner threat. Maybe what has kept you exhausted is not feeling, but self-persecution. Maybe what has distorted your choices is not sensitivity, but the terror of sensitivity. Maybe what you called strength was only numbness under pressure. And maybe real steadiness begins where fear no longer has to masquerade as discipline. So here is the harder question. If your whole life can start to reorder itself the moment you stop treating cruelty as sacred, what part of you still insists that being merciless with yourself is the only way not to collapse? And what might finally be born when that lie is no longer the voice you trust most? Self-cruelty was never just a bad habit you picked up by accident. It was a survival method that stayed in charge long after the danger changed. At some point, your mind decided it had to strike first before life did, condemn yourself before anyone else could, reject yourself before anyone else had the chance. And that strategy built a false sense of safety that slowly turned inward. It taught you to suffer early as if early suffering could reduce later pain, as if bracing in advance could soften the blow when love went cold, as if rehearsing rejection could somehow make rejection hurt less when it arrived. But all it really did was make your inner world impossible to rest inside. Nobody grows where they have to stay guarded against themselves every day. That is why even your good moments can feel contaminated by tension. You laugh, but part of you questions whether you earned the right to laugh. You rest, but another voice instantly calls it laziness and waste. You are loved, and still some hidden place inside starts scanning for danger. You receive something beautiful, yet your first instinct is to fear its disappearance. It is not that joy is foreign to you. It is that vigilance learned how to invade joy before it could settle. Your mind got so used to checking for loss that peace began to feel suspicious, so you never simply live the moment that is here. You also live the fear of how quickly that moment could be taken away. Buddha taught that an untended mind keeps chasing, resisting, grasping, and fearing. It runs after what feels pleasant and fights whatever feels unpleasant. It clings to what it wants and panics at whatever threatens its image. And when that movement never stops, even calm begins to look unsafe. You start distrusting relief because relief feels too fragile to believe in. There is also something more subtle happening inside you. You do not suffer only because of what you think. You suffer because of the way your mind delivers its thoughts to you. The same realization can arrive as truth that frees you or as a blade that shames you. And your pain often comes less from insight than from the violence wrapped around it. You can notice a mistake and become wiser because of it, or you can notice a mistake and use it as evidence against your worth. You can admit that you need comfort and become more honest, or you can admit that need and treat yourself as weak, embarrassing, and lesser. So the wound is not only in looking inward, but in how brutally you learn to look. Buddhist teaching speaks of Vedana, the immediate tone of experience. Before the full story appears, there is already a felt contact in the body. Something lands as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral before thought builds its courtroom. A message arrives, a silence stretches, a face changes, and your body registers it first. Most of the time you miss that first moment and leap straight into interpretation. That leap is where your relationship with yourself gets lost. Feeling the tightness is one thing, but building a destiny from it is another. The chest contracts, and within seconds your mind announces a whole identity. Something is wrong with me. I ruined this. I will be left. I never change. The sensation was brief, but the story turns it into a prison sentence. This is exactly where Buddha's clarity becomes radical. He points to the birth of reaction before it hardens into suffering. He invites you to witness the moment after impact and before self-attack, not after the spiral has already swallowed the day, but at the first opening. That small window is where freedom either enters or disappears, but that requires a courage you may not have practiced very often. The courage to stay with discomfort for a few seconds without explaining it away, without fixing it, without condemning it, without rushing to become someone else. Just feeling what came, noticing what moved, and watching the urge to escape. For a person used to reacting like an alarm system, that is almost revolutionary. Maybe you have lived in automatic mode for so long that feeling and reacting seem identical. Sadness arrives, and you shut down before you even know sadness is here. Fear arises, and your whole body hardens into defense without permission. Shame appears, and your first move is to disappear or punish yourself. Even peace can make you uneasy, because part of you expects the cost to follow. Your mind became an expert in defense. But defense, when it never turns off, stops being protection and starts becoming suffocation. The soul cannot breathe where every feeling is treated like a threat to your identity. Even love becomes tiring when your system stays braced for loss. And eventually, you confuse constant tension with normal life. Buddha also taught about sankhara, the conditioned patterns that keep repeating themselves. You do not react from nowhere, and you do not punish yourself in random ways. There are grooves in you shaped by repetition, memory, fear, and old adaptation. The way you hide, the way you overwork, the way you appease, the way you collapse. None of that appeared fully formed. It was trained into you through time. That matters because what was conditioned is not the same as what is eternal. A repeated pattern can feel like personality simply because it has been there for years. But repetition is not identity, and familiarity is not destiny. Some of what you call your nature is only an old defense performing on autopilot. And the moment you see that, you stop bowing to every impulse as truth. Then a new sentence becomes possible inside you. This is here, but I do not have to obey it. This wave has risen, but I can see it before I become it. This hurts, but I do not need to deepen the pain by attacking myself. That shift may look small from the outside, but it restores something essential. It starts giving your dignity back. Dignity does not return when you finally become flawless and untouchable. It returns when you stop treating yourself like garbage on imperfect days. It returns when you fail and do not exile yourself from your own heart. It returns when confusion visits and you refuse to rename yourself as permanently broken. Buddha never offered humiliation as a sacred path. He offered understanding, and understanding is a completely different force. To understand means to see causes without collapsing into self-hatred over consequences. It means tracing the pattern without turning the pattern into your permanent name. That is not indulgence. It is accuracy with compassion attached. Maybe this is why slowing down scares you so much. Speed helps you avoid hearing what your deeper life has been trying to say. If you keep moving, you can stay impressive, useful, functional, and hard to question. But when the noise drops and the night becomes honest, your relationship with yourself steps forward. And what aches most may not be the exhaustion, but the absence of inner refuge. You may no longer know how to be with yourself without pressure, without distraction, without performance, without inner surveillance, without escape. The rush has given you a temporary identity that feels safer than stillness. Motion makes you feel less exposed to what is unresolved. But healing does not begin when you finally admire everything inside you. It begins when discomfort stops being treated as rejection. You may dislike your current state and still remain loyal to yourself within it. You may dislike your confusion and still refuse to become cruel. You may dislike your sadness and still sit beside it instead of abandoning it. That is enormous, especially if your loyalty used to depend on how well you were doing. For a long time, you only stayed close to yourself when you felt admirable, when you were productive, composed, generous, strong, and bright enough to impress even your own mind. But the moment you became messy, tired, needy, or hard to understand, you withdrew your warmth. You became distant from yourself exactly when you most needed tenderness. That is where the deepest betrayal has often happened. There is a word in Buddhism for the medicine that interrupts this betrayal: karuna. Compassion has been softened so much in modern language that people miss its power. Compassion is not pity, not weakness, not sentimental decoration for spiritual people. It is the refusal to abandon pain when pain appears. It is the choice not to answer vulnerability with ridicule or contempt. It means you stop treating your hardest moments like crimes. You stop assuming suffering needs punishment before it can become growth. You start seeing that correction does not require cruelty and learning does not require humiliation. You can become wiser without being shattered first. But to discover that, you have to stop worshipping hardness simply because it resembles strength. The truth is that much of your strength was built from fear, not peace. Yes, you endured a lot, but endurance alone is not proof of health. Sometimes endurance is just what happens when there is nowhere safe to collapse. Sometimes it is the habit of surviving without ever being held. Sometimes It is the belief that relaxing even slightly would make everything fall apart. So you keep moving, tired, guarded, efficient on the outside, disappearing slowly on the inside. And then people wonder why being loved by others does not solve everything for you. But if you cannot rest in your own presence, even love starts feeling like an exam. You do not receive affection cleanly. You interrogate it for hidden conditions. Is this real? Will it last? What happens when I fail? What if they see too much? That is how fear turns tenderness into tension. Not because love is false, but because your inner ground still shakes too easily. And while that ground remains unstable, you will keep asking the world for guarantees it cannot give. What needs to form first is an inner floor that does not collapse at every uncertainty. That floor is not built through motivational slogans. It is built through humble, repeated practice in ordinary moments. It grows when the old accusing voice arrives, and you do not kneel before it. It grows when sadness comes, and you stop treating sadness like something shameful. It grows when your body asks for rest, and you listen without calling yourself weak. It grows when a mistake happens, and you do not turn that mistake into a biography. It grows when your mind wants to flee, and you stay present one breath longer. It grows when you understand that peace is not the absence of pain. Peace is the absence of unnecessary war against pain, and if that war begins to weaken, something long suffocated inside you can finally breathe. Maybe that is the real turning point. Not that your past suddenly disappears, or your mind becomes permanently quiet, but that the pattern becomes visible before you mistake it for your character again. You recognize the old cruelty as a survival script rather than a sacred truth. And that recognition is already the opening of the door. Because once you see it clearly, you cannot fully call it wisdom anymore. You notice the accusing voice and understand that it is not depth. You notice the reflex to reject yourself and see that it is not discipline. You notice how often you tried to survive by hurting yourself before life could hurt you. And in that moment, a new kind of freedom enters the room. Buddha offered a path of lucidity, presence, and release from suffering fed by clinging and aversion. Perhaps now, the deepest practice in your life is no longer impressing the world with your strength. Perhaps it is learning not to become violent with yourself in the unseen places, learning to breathe before the verdict, to feel without becoming a tribunal, to stay close on ugly days. That is where your relationship with yourself truly starts to change. It does not change first because circumstances improve. It changes because you stop abandoning yourself in the middle of experience, because you stop making your inner life a hostile environment, because you begin offering presence before perfection, patience before punishment, honesty before performance. That is not a small adjustment. It is a different way of being alive. And once that shift begins, your whole life starts reorganizing around it. You choose differently when fear is no longer disguised as personality. You love differently when your worth is no longer on trial in every silence. You rest differently when pause no longer feels like moral failure. You walk through pain differently when pain is no longer proof that you should be rejected. So if something in this message found the place you kept hidden, answer it directly, write it where you can see it, and where your own eyes cannot dodge it. I stop abandoning myself, not because everything is fixed, but because I refuse to keep being my own enemy. That sentence alone can become a threshold if you mean it when the next hard moment comes. And if this truth touched the exact war you have been fighting in secret, pass it forward. There is someone else out there mistaking self-cruelty for maturity right now. Someone else calling inner punishment responsibility while their heart slowly collapses under it. Let this reach the person who needs to remember that awareness without kindness becomes a weapon. Let it reach the one who has forgotten that gentleness can also be strength. Now be honest with yourself in the deepest way you can. When your mind comes back with its old accusations, what will you do this time? Will you hand it your faith the way you always have? Or will you finally begin standing on your own side, even while your hands still shake? Because the life you want may begin at the exact moment you stop joining the attack.